Hello. Today the five of us will be talking about the legal system of the country of India and how it compares to the legal system we have in the United States, the ways in which they are alike and the ways in which they're different. So I'll be starting us off with a little general notes about the history of both countries and the legal system they inherited from their father of sorts, Great Britain. You don't often think about America and India having much of a common history, but of course they did both begin their lives as countries as British colonies. India was conquered by the British by force in around 1727, and a system of common law first started to take its roots around that time. Whereas, of course, in 1607 we had the first British colonists voluntarily setting foot in the New World. America was under the rule of British common law from 1607 until they declared their independence from Britain in 1776, whereas India was under the rule of common law for a little longer until 1947 when they declared their own independence and won it after a hard fight. At first, India had some problems adjusting to the rule of common law, and part of that was because India was not at first directly under the rule of the British government per se, but actually it was governed sort of haphazardly by the British East India Company, which had other priorities besides making sure everything was just. For a little while, well, not a little while, about 100 years, the British East India Company tried at first to sort of have it both ways and apply British law to the British people living in India while applying the native Indian legal system that was based in their own customs and traditions, while applying that Indian system to Indian disputes between Indian people. And that was just so complex and troublesome and awful that it just caused so many more problems than it solved. Eventually things were going badly enough that in 1857 there was a great big rebellion called the Sepoy Mutiny, and after that point the British kind of realized, you know, we should be taking this governance a little more seriously. Eventually the British just decided that every Indian person living within the colony of India would be a British subject, and so they would all be held to the same standard of British common law. So from around that point forward, everyone was held under the same legal system in India. America, on the other hand, was a little different because we weren't conquered, and we were coming from the same culture as Britain. Of course, most British people came over voluntarily, and people who weren't, prisoners in Georgia and whatnot. But America was governed from very far away by the British Parliament, which of course was across the Atlantic Ocean. And so even in the best of times, it would take sometimes months for something to get all the way across, and for a law to be passed, or for something like that. And so it was inconvenient in its own ways. And of course, when America declared its independence and sent this Declaration of Independence to King George, they included this long list of grievances and things that King George had imposed on the colonies that they were just not going to put up with anymore. And one of those, in fact, was that he has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices. And so, the legal system and the governmental system are always going to be kind of bound up, and most of their grievances were about the government. But at the same time, King George could fire any judge he wanted anytime he wanted. And we've talked about judicial independence and restraint, and how, of course, it's important to have judges free to make their own decisions and to cast judgment in an objective way. And when everything was at the mercy of King George, and it could sometimes take months for decisions to pass, or he could dismiss anyone anytime he wanted, it wasn't just, and it was just one of many, many reasons that just tipped the balance and caused America to seek its independence. So, of course, we had a Revolutionary War, and we won. And so afterwards, there was a period of time where everyone was trying to discuss how to improve the legal and governmental systems that we had from Britain. We tried the Articles of Confederation, and that was a huge disaster. And so around 1787, everyone was talking about how the U.S. Constitution could create a better legal system and a more just, perfect one than maybe the common law system that we had from England. The major sort of ideological debate was between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalist parties, who were talking about the Federalists in favor of a strong central government with a lot of authority to get things done, because the previous Articles of Confederation had failed at that. Whereas the Anti-Federalists were saying, well, we just had a really centralized government under King George, and that was terrible, so the states and the people need to be free to govern themselves and to make their own laws and things. And so Alexander Hamilton and several other people were writing a bunch of letters that came to be called the Federalist Papers, open letters to newspapers in New York and in New England, talking about their opinions about the Constitution and what sorts of a legal system we should have, what sort of government we should have. Hamilton was defending actually the federal court structure, which some people kind of looked sideways at, like, oh, are we sure we want like a big central court having authority over all our smaller ones? Like, why can't we govern ourselves? And Hamilton used the analogy of the organs of the body to describe as like, we are all part of one body. Our organs are still able to do their own things. They all have their own separate functions. But at the end of the day, we all do need to work towards this common purpose, or we won't be united enough to be a strong nation. India, on the other hand, well, they also won their independence in sort of a dramatic fashion. It took a little longer, but what's different is that before India won their independence, the British had taken some great pains to make sure that Indians were more involved in their own governance. They had actually gotten Indian people elected to government positions and appointed to positions, and even before Indian independence had come about, you would see common law being used in Indian courtrooms, being argued by Indian lawyers before Indian judges. And so over the 100 or 150 or so years that they were all practicing this common law, it took a little more root in their culture. It came to be seen as more just and more practicable. And so by the time India did earn its independence from Britain in 1947, common law was quite popular. It was working well, and the founders of the new country of India decided that we should just go ahead and keep this. It's working really well, although it was not without a few slight adjustments. For example, in 1960, India outlawed jury trials completely, which would surprise you, thinking that it seems like kind of a staple of the common law system. But it just goes to show the cultural differences between India and perhaps the West. Strangers aren't seen as impartial. It seemed as though, if some random guy off the street is deciding my fate, he could be biased. I don't trust him. Whereas, of course, the United States has protected the right to jury trial again and again. We reinforced it in the Bill of Rights, in the Sixth Amendment, and elsewhere. It's very important to us. And so both countries, while inheriting the same system of law from Britain, have still been able to adapt that system in ways that suit their own cultures and that suit the different values that they bring to the table. And that's it.
So I will be talking about prejudice and casteism in the Indian judicial system. This is a very basic hierarchy of the caste system. So Brahmins are at the top of the caste system. They're considered priests, though these days they're not really priests anymore. They're kind of the 1%. We can skip over them because this is a very basic hierarchy. So actually there are some Shudras who are above Vaishyas and some Vaishyas that are above the Kshatriyas. And even you can find Kshatriyas that are above Brahmins. It's a very complicated system. Nobody can actually map it, and nobody's tried, thankfully. The caste system actually ends right here. So Dalits and Adivasis aren't actually in the caste system. So they're outside or below, depending on who you are and how you want to classify it. They tend to occupy these positions, which are scheduled tribes, scheduled castes, backwards classes, and other backwards classes. These are protected in the Constitution. They're the ones who get reservations, they're like affirmative action positions, so they're allotted for in colleges and in all jobs. And a lot of people come up with excuses not to employ them or something like they haven't found anybody who's qualified for the position. So that's when we're going to be discussing in this session, we're going to basically be talking about Dalits versus Brahmins. I mean, technically it's not Brahmins, but it's this entire section right here. Judges, because there are allotments for judges that are protected, so there are reservations in the judicial system for judges. So you're going to find a lot of Dalits that get into this position. They face a lot of harassment, a lot of messed up things that other judges will do to them, because obviously you've heard the arguments. They weren't qualified, they were handed the position, they didn't earn it, and all that nonsense. So and there's a lot of case system going on too. So other judges will they'll do some really messed up stuff. They won't invite them to parties that all of their other friends are invited to, or work people. They'll make them eat on the floor. They'll abuse them verbally, emotionally, in any other way they can find. Actually, if there are two judges that are being sworn in on the same day, they will make sure that the higher case judge is sworn in before the lower case judge, just so that they can assure that the lower case judge cannot be promoted to Chief Justice before the higher case judge. Cases rulings, there are a lot of cases rulings. It's just like the United States. A lot of people won't get convicted for really ridiculous reasons, or they just won't say they have enough evidence or anything like that, or it's just unproven. But one that I did find, this woman, she was a lower case, and she was raped, she was gang raped, and the men got off, and the judge actually said, since the accused are uppercase men, the rape could not have taken place because she was from a lower caste. And that's obviously ridiculous. There's quite a bit of evidence saying that she did get raped. But that was actually in the opinion section. So, just like African Americans or any other minorities, low case defendants are more likely to be convicted. There's a lot of implicit bias. There's a lot of explicit bias. It's pretty obvious in India a lot of times when there's bias. I mean, as you just saw from what the other judge said. I mean, it's not as swept under the rug as it is in the United States. A lot of Dalits or lowercase people. They receive less education. They work as children, so I mean, they drop out of school really early. They don't, a lot of times they don't even receive any education because it's not protected in India. I mean, children aren't required to go to school. It's very controversial, actually. They generally, because they receive less education, they get a lot fewer jobs. Or a lot worse jobs. Dalits will often be, in a local village, they'll be the ones that are cleaning out the latrines and scooping up poop, or you'll find them in trash dumps sorting through trash. They don't get gloves or anything like that. They're not protected by OSHA, so they don't get any of these allowances. So they make very small amount of money, so they can't hire decent legal representation. So all of these issues and more are reasons why they're more likely to be convicted. Religion, some of the major religions in India, Muslims, Sikhs, Jains, Zoroastrians, they're referred to as Parsis. This is an ethnic group, but that's what you'll hear them called. Buddhists and Christians, those are very small groups. So Sikhs and Muslims are the two main groups that you'll hear about in India. Sikhs are the ones that wear turbans that get stopped in customs and whatnot all the time. So actually, there is a caste system in Muslim society in India. Unfortunately, that is the one thing they picked up culturally. So you will see a lot of Muslims that'll experience the same kind of hierarchy and the same kind of prejudice. But also, compounding on that, there is a lot of contention between Hindus and Muslims in India, and there has been long time. But recently, since about late 1800s, there's been a lot of radicalization in Hinduism. So it's kind of, I would compare it to the Tea Party, except much more violent. So in 1992, there was this mosque in this city in northern India, and a bunch of Hindus decided, they claimed that it was Ram's birthplace, which is a Hindu deity. He's a major Hindu deity too. And they claimed, yeah, the mosque was the birthplace of Ram, and they wanted to tear it down and put up a temple because they claimed that the mosque had torn down a temple and put up the mosque in place, which is probably likely, but I mean, it happened all the time. And actually the mosque did end up being torn down in the middle of the night because the police allowed it and the government official there allowed it. But this sparked national riots, and it was very violent. A lot of major cities, well, not a lot, half a dozen, actually broke down, and there would be giant groups of Hindus who would go out and they would find Muslims and they would behead them, they would rape them, they would set them on fire, and it was just an atrocity. And then Muslims, groups of Muslims go out and they do the same thing, and it was like a war zone for a few months. And this is something India is very ashamed of, but all of this fighting really went into the judicial system, and it shows. It shows in prejudice against Muslims in the courtroom. So yeah, I think I've talked about caseism and racism. Both in the India and in the United States, people are protected against racism and casteism. And regardless of this, a lot of people aren't prosecuted. They aren't convicted of either of these things, and it's really a shame. Reservations and affirmative action, yes. In India, reservations are a lot more broad. They're not just in the educational world. They're everywhere, and they're incredibly controversial. And most people figure out a way to get around them. And police violence, actually. Amanda will talk about that. So, yep, and that's it.
Alright, my section of the presentation is about policing in India and how it affects the communities and the legal system. So the role of religion, as was talked about before, Muslims are, I'm talking mostly about the main groups, so not as specific. Muslims in India are targeted and treated like criminals, especially by police and by the communities. The police tend to side with the Hindus and even taking part in the social events against Muslims, like protests or just other events that they might have in the communities. The police tend to profile Muslims as terrorists, criminals, and as being dangerous, and this is also how they treat them too, like during protests and things, by not protecting them and even taking part in those activities. Very few Muslims are police officers or hold police type roles, and most of them that are in supervisory positions, so they're not necessarily like on the streets per se with the public. Police demographics also do not represent the community, especially in the communities that have high tension. Very similar to like the United States, where we have like inner city communities, and the police that are made up like of mostly white men in a very inner city African American community. The government and police do not always see eye to eye either in India. Police have gotten in trouble for not stopping violence, particularly with like the protests that were there by taking part in them and not stopping them, and the government has had trouble controlling the police and even getting them to do what they want as well. So the police model in India, they are still considered an old model. They have older weapons, but more importantly, old ways of handling conflict, and particularly by using violence. The police image is very poor, and their social image is scary. Many people are scared of the police, they want nothing to do with them, and they are just scared when they come around. The lack of trust between the communities and the police is very great, as I said before, mostly because of the amount of violence associated with the police instead of support from the police. The case, classes, gender, religion, and income play a vital role in how the police respond. As talked about before, they tend to take sides with different classes, different genders, all of those things. It's a big problem in India. So the police effect on society, a lot of people are too scared, especially the Muslims or your lower classes are too scared to report crimes. I found out through the one book I read that they have no dispatch system like we do, and so people have to report directly to the police. And when they report to the police almost like interrogate them because the crimes must be registered, and who's reporting it has to be registered, and all the information given, so there's no calling up and being anonymous like we can do here. And the police lack reform, even though the government is pushing for change. It still is not, it's coming around very slowly. So, and police are supposed to reflect what society thinks of humanity, and it does not show the response to abnormal behavior. The book I read talked about how communities expect the police and the government to handle certain situations that are considered abnormal or bad, and the police are not following that kind of like a code of ethics. So the country also has a big division similar to the United States, where they have a large population that has growing basic needs like even shelter, food, water, and the police are seen as aggressors to those communities. So instead of helping them, they are just making the problem worse. So police are not helping to are not helping the government fix those basic problems, and also things like unemployment, political agendas, and then corruption are remaining a big problem and then getting worse by what the police are doing. So a comparison to the United States. So religion plays more of a role directly with the police in India than in the United States, just because of how they are treated differently. Both countries do have a problem with communities being represented by the police, and as I mentioned before, like in the United States, or inner city communities, or especially the communities that have more of an economic problem, are not as well represented, usually by race, with the police. The U.S. is farther along with equipment and training than in India, and that's what I was talking about with like the old model of policing. Police in India still tend to just be very violent, versus in the U.S. we have other methods, like even such as, tasers and sprays, and more training on how to handle people. The police image is poor in both countries, however, it's not as bad in the United States as in India. I think in the United States, the different economic classes tend to have a different view. Unlike in India, I think there's just more poor views all across the board. Police ethics reflect more of society in the U.S. versus in India. And that kind of goes back to my previous point as well. And the police in India tend to have their own agenda, versus the police in the United States do at least follow what the government wants to have happen and what communities want to have happen. The police in the U.S. also help educate the struggling communities, and I know especially in recent years, with all that's been going on, that has been even a bigger push for police to get out in the communities, educate them, help them, provide resources. Versus in India, they've been pretty stagnant, and they are still trying to just control their communities by force and violence.
Alright, so I'm going to be talking about the gun laws, comparing them between the U.S. and India. So they can be labeled as permissive versus restrictive. In the United States, having permissive laws, that means that most people who apply for a license are able to get one. And the administering authority has to show that an individual is a member of a prohibited group if the application is denied. Prohibited people would include those who have convicted a crime and been imprisoned for more than a year, fugitives, those who have been committed to a mental institution or are considered mentally unstable, an illegal alien, someone who's been dishonorably discharged from the armed forces, someone who has renounced his or her citizenship, and someone who's been convicted of a misdemeanor crime or of domestic violence. On the other hand, gun laws of India can be labeled as restrictive because the presumption used in permissive systems is reversed. The applicant has to prove to the administering authority that he or she needs a gun and has to prove to have good character. And in addition to that, they also are required to have submit several different documents, which include a ration card, election card, character certificates, which are from responsible citizens from their locality, physical fitness certificate, proof of education qualifications, a birth certificate, and it can also just depend on where and who they're dealing with. It can be more than that. And the process itself can take several years. The biggest difference is that the U.S. Constitution, the Second Amendment, guarantees the right of citizens to bear arms. In India, citizens are legally allowed to have guns, but it's not a right guaranteed by the law, and it's strictly regulated by the Arms Act of 1959, which reinforces the historical system under British colonial rule, which had aimed to disarm all the citizens to prevent an uprising. And firearm regulation in the United States is regulated by federal, state, and local authorities. And in India, the firearms are regulated by the Ministry of Home Affairs, International Security Division 2. Implementation and enforcement is by the state, territory, metropolitan, and special task police forces. And then in the U.S., additionally, the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Some recent developments. There's the new restrictions in India in 2016 began restructuring their already strict gun laws. Under new rules, prospective gun owners will have to show that they have been trained, can only carry guns in holders, and secure them in lockers at home, not loaded. The Indian government will declare new gun-free zones, similar to what we have here, like schools and other public areas. And even air guns, which are also known as pellet guns, will require a license. In the U.S., recent developments, of course, we have the several mass shootings that have happened within the last year and a half. Texas, Las Vegas, and Florida. So that has raised questions and uncertainty of the effectiveness of our gun laws here in the U.S. So both of these charts show some startling statistics. If you look at the one on the left, so the United States, I took the information from 2014, which is at the end of each, the edge of each chart. The population of the United States is 324 million, and the population of India is 1.3 billion. But if you look at this, in 2014, there were 33,599 death totals by gun violence, and in India, it was 3,655, which I think is just crazy because, I mean, look at the population. So, some things to consider. The U.S. gun culture has existed since we've been guaranteed the right to own guns, since 1791. America owns nearly half, 48%, of the estimated 650 million civilian-owned guns worldwide. What can we learn from India's restrictive gun laws? The statistics show that having strict laws may decrease deaths by gun violence, but the U.S. won't likely be changing gun laws anytime soon. Americans love their guns.
Hi, I'm going to talk about human trafficking, comparison between India and the United States. Human trafficking is an egregious human rights violation, and it occurs throughout the world. One of the issues is it's a complex cross-border, it's international as well as national, and it requires a coordinated multidisciplinary team. A few key definitions. The U.S. Department of State defines human trafficking as a form of modern-day slavery in which traffickers use force, fraud, coercion to control victims for the purpose of engaging in commercial sex acts or labor services against his or her will. And it's a crime under both federal as well as international law. A lot of people, when they think of human trafficking, don't realize that there are two main types. There's sex trafficking as well as labor trafficking, and depending on the country, it varies as to which one is more prevalent. But sex trafficking can include things like people working in brothels, escorts, fake massage businesses, adult entertainment clubs, forced prostitution and forced marriage, labor trafficking. This primarily is related to bonded labor, where there's a debt between the worker and the owner, but additional forms of trafficking include a lot of domestic work, forced begging, working amongst businesses, factories, farms, as well as there's some forced recruitment into the armed services. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline has statistics for the United States, and since 2007, when they started monitoring, there's been 23,035 victims of sex trafficking, and this year alone, almost 3,200. You'll see the majority are female. The adult to minor ratio is about equal, and the top states are California, Texas, and Florida. This slide is the prevalence of labor trafficking. It's significantly less, about 12,500. This year, 689 victims. Here, males and females are about equal, but adults are significantly more than children. And the top states are the same, California, Texas, and Florida. So in the United States, one of the main federal laws to combat human trafficking is the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And it was the first comprehensive federal law to address human trafficking. And there's a three-pronged approach, and it's prevention, protection, and prosecution. The United States Code has a couple of definitions, sex trafficking and labor trafficking. The one that I just want to point out is debt bondage, the status or condition of a debtor arising from a pledge by the debtor of his or her personal services, or of those of a person under his or her control as a security for debt. President Obama signed the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act in 2015, and basically this created a U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. They implemented a national strategy for combating human trafficking, also helped strengthen and support the services for victims, as well as stronger punishment for those that perpetuate the crime. Now, in terms of human trafficking in India, in 2009, the United Nations made this lengthy protocol named the United Nations Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. And the key thing here is it's a collaborative, multidisciplinary national and international organization to eradicate human trafficking. And it was ratified by the government in India in May of 2001. And the State Department classifies various countries, and India is recognized as Tier 2 because they do not fully meet the minimum standards that the protocol by the United Nations has set forth. Here is a map showing the various countries and their classification. There's Tier 1 where they fully comply and meet the standards. Tier 2, India. Tier 2 watch list, that means they don't meet the standards, but they also have a very high level of victims. And then Tier 3, they do not meet the standard. And then there's some special classifications. In India, India is a source, destination, and transit country for sex and labor trafficking. As Thea mentioned, the population of India is about 1.3 billion. And the estimates for the number of people in forced labor trafficking in India are anywhere from 20 to 65 million. And then for sex workers or sex trafficking, approximately 3 million. And in India, it's very hard to get adequate numbers as to the people involved in human trafficking, primarily because there's an inherent sort of clandestine nature of the crime, and as Nicole mentioned, there's significant distrust by the people of the police, as well as police and official corruption. Why does human trafficking occur to such a great extent in India? Poverty is the primary reason. It's also a patriarchal culture, poor employment opportunities, women's rights aren't emphasized as much, low levels of education and discrimination, things like the caste system. So India has a few laws that they have adopted to help deal with the extent of human trafficking in their country. 2013, the Criminal Law Amendment Act, it amended Section 370 of the India Penal Code, and it was the first definition of human trafficking that was included in the government legislature, and it was based on the UN Trafficking Protocol. And then there's the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, ITPA, and that authorizes or sanctions the central government to establish an authority for the prevention of human trafficking. Briefly touch on this, 1976, India's Bonded Labor System Abolition Act. It's under Article 23 of the Indian Constitution, and essentially it criminalizes the type of forced labor where there is a debt or owed to the trafficker. So what should India do in terms of trying to help alleviate the significance of the human trafficking problem? Basically, they need to meet the minimum standards for the elimination of human trafficking as outlined in the United Nations Protocol. There's a number of different things they can do. Victim identification, prosecute and convict, help eliminate corruption. There's jurisdictional issues, help train the police force better, do not penalize the victims, protect the victims' confidentiality and privacy, increase access to services and funding, and there's more legislation that can be enacted. So, to sum up for everyone, India is undergoing a remarkable transition. There's economic growth that's driving rapid social and political change, and as such, there are ambitious programs of legal and social reform that are being launched. Thank you.